14-year-old Ethan Cole walked 15 miles in worn-out shoes to claim a $50,000 reward that every veterinarian in the country had failed to earn. What he did inside that stable brought the wealthiest man in Montana to tears. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun cast golden rays through the wooden slats of the massive barn, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny fragments of hope. The Hartwell Ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Montana land, a testament to the wealth and power of its owner, Richard Hartwell, a man whose fortune had been built on the backs of championship horses and shrewd business deals. His property was legendary in those parts, with pristine white fences that stretched toward the horizon and stables that rivaled the finest hotels in the state. Every detail of the ranch spoke of opulence, from the imported marble troughs to the climate-controlled barns, where horses worth more than most people's homes lived in absolute comfort. Richard Hartwell himself was a man of 62 years, with silver hair that he kept neatly combed beneath his signature gray Stetson hat. His face bore the weathered lines of someone who had spent decades in the sun, yet his eyes held the sharp glint of a businessman who had never lost a negotiation. He wore tailored suits even when walking through his pastures, and his boots were custom-made Italian leather that had never touched actual mud. To the people of the small town of Cedar Falls, Richard Hartwell was both admired and feared. He employed dozens of locals on his ranch, paid them fairly enough, but everyone knew that crossing him meant the end of their livelihood in this corner of Montana. Among his many prized possessions, there was one horse that stood above all others. His name was Thunder, a magnificent chestnut stallion whose coat gleamed like polished copper under the sunlight. Thunder had been the crown jewel of the Hartwell stable for 7 years, winning championships across the country and bringing home trophies that now lined an entire wall of Richard's study. The horse moved with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his skin as he galloped across the training grounds. People came from neighboring states just to watch Thunder run, and offers to purchase him had reached into the millions, all of which Richard had refused. Thunder was not just a horse to him. He was a symbol of everything Richard had achieved, a living trophy that represented his dominance in the world of equestrian excellence. But fate, as it often does, had other plans for Thunder and his proud owner. It happened on a crisp autumn morning during what should have been a routine training session. Thunder was running the track at full speed, his hooves pounding against the packed earth like drum beats announcing his magnificence to the world. The head trainer, a man named Marcus who had worked with horses for over 30 years, watched with satisfaction as Thunder rounded the final curve. Then, in a moment that would replay in everyone's memories for months to come, something went terribly wrong. Thunder's front right leg buckled beneath him, and the magnificent stallion crashed to the ground with a sound that made everyone present wince in horror. The horse screamed, a sound so filled with pain and confusion that it seemed to echo across the entire ranch. Within minutes, the ranch's veterinarian was on the scene, his face growing more grave with each passing second as he examined Thunder's injured leg. Richard Hartwell stood nearby, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face visibly strained. He watched as the veterinarian ran his hands along the swollen leg, shaking his head slowly in a way that needed no words to interpret. The diagnosis came swiftly and without mercy. Thunder had suffered a severe tendon injury, the kind that ended careers and often led to outcomes that no horse owner wanted to contemplate. The weeks that followed were a parade of specialists, each more expensive and renowned than the last. Veterinarians flew in from California, Kentucky, and even Europe, each one examining Thunder with the latest equipment and offering their professional opinions. Richard spared no expense, writing checks that would have made ordinary men gasp. He brought in acupuncturists, massage therapists, and even a horse psychologist who claimed to communicate with animals through meditation. The stable where Thunder was housed became a revolving door of experts, each promising hope and each eventually leaving with apologetic expressions and fat fees in their pockets. Despite all the money, despite all the expertise, Thunder showed no improvement. The once proud stallion now stood in his stall with his head hanging low, refusing to put weight on his injured leg. The fire that had once burned in his eyes had dimmed to a flicker, and his magnificent coat had lost its luster. He barely ate, barely moved, and seemed to have accepted his fate with a resignation that broke the hearts of everyone who had known him in his glory days. The ranch hands whispered among themselves that it might be kinder to end Thunder's suffering, but no one dared suggest such a thing to Richard Hartwell. It was during one of these dark evenings, as Richard sat alone in his study surrounded by Thunder's trophies and ribbons, that desperation finally cracked his pride. He had tried everything money could buy, consulted every expert his considerable resources could reach, and yet his prized horse continued to deteriorate before his eyes. The thought of losing Thunder was unbearable, not just because of the financial investment or the status the horse represented, but because somewhere beneath Richard's hard exterior, he genuinely loved the animal. In a moment of desperation that would later become legend, Richard made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. The next morning, a notice appeared in the Cedar Falls Gazette and on bulletin boards throughout the county. The message was simple but extraordinary. Richard Hartwell was offering $50,000 to anyone who could cure his lame horse. There were no requirements about credentials or experience. Whether you were a veterinarian with decades of training or a farmer with folk remedies passed down through generations, you were welcome to try. The only condition was results. If Thunder walked again without pain, if he recovered even a fraction of his former glory, the money was yours. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. $50,000 was more money than most families in Cedar Falls saw in 2 years. It was enough to change a life, to pay off mortgages, to send children to college. And so began a parade of hopefuls, each one arriving at the Hartwell Ranch with promises of miracles and dreams of wealth dancing in their eyes. The first to arrive was a renowned equine specialist from Denver, a woman named Dr. Patricia Langley, who had published numerous papers on tendon rehabilitation in horses. She drove up in a Mercedes SUV, her assistant trailing behind with cases of equipment that looked more suited to a hospital than a barn. Richard greeted her personally, something he rarely did for anyone, and led her to Thunder's stall with the careful hope of a man grasping at his last straws. Dr. Langley spent 3 hours examining Thunder, running tests and taking measurements, speaking in medical terminology that impressed everyone within earshot. When she finally emerged from the stall, she announced a comprehensive treatment plan that would cost an additional $20,000 and take approximately 8 weeks to show results. Richard agreed without hesitation, and for the next 2 months, Thunder was subjected to a regimen of specialized exercises, electrical stimulation therapy, and a diet supplemented with compounds whose names sounded more like chemistry experiments than food. Dr. Langley visited weekly, adjusting her protocols and expressing cautious optimism at each appointment. Yet as the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear that Thunder was not improving. If anything, the horse seemed more withdrawn, more defeated, as if each failed treatment stripped away another layer of his will to recover. When the 8 weeks concluded with Thunder still unable to walk without a pronounced limp, Dr. Langley packed her equipment with professional composure, offered her condolences, and drove away in her expensive car, leaving Richard standing in the dust of her departure. After the specialist came the alternative healers, a colorful procession of individuals who promised what science could not deliver. There was an elderly Native American man who claimed his ancestors had passed down secret knowledge about healing horses through sacred ceremonies. He burned sage in Thunder's stall and chanted songs that echoed through the barn long into the night. The ranch hands watched with a mixture of skepticism and hope, but when morning came, Thunder remained as lame as before. A woman from California arrived next, introducing herself as an energy healer who could realign Thunder's chakras and restore the flow of life force through his injured leg. She spent an entire week at the ranch, waving crystals over the horse and speaking to him in soothing tones about universal love and healing light. Thunder regarded her with the patient tolerance of an animal who had grown accustomed to human foolishness, but his leg showed no improvement. The attempts continued in an almost endless stream. A retired jockey swore that a specific combination of herbs and minerals had saved countless horses during his career. A veterinary student from the state university asked for the chance to try an experimental treatment he had been developing for his thesis. An old farmer from 3 counties over arrived with a jar of homemade salve that his grandfather had supposedly used to cure everything from broken bones to blindness in horses. Each one entered the Hartwell Ranch with confidence and left with disappointment. The $50,000 remained unclaimed, and Thunder remained lame, his condition now a permanent fixture of ranch life that everyone had learned to accept as unchangeable. As the months passed, Richard Hartwell's demeanor darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The man who had once walked the property with the confidence of a king now shuffled through his days with slumped shoulders and hollow eyes. He spent long hours sitting beside Thunder's stall, speaking to the horse in low tones that no one else could hear. The ranch hands noticed that he had stopped wearing his tailored suits, opting instead for simple work clothes that made him look like any ordinary farmer. The transformation was so complete that visitors to the ranch sometimes failed to recognize him as the wealthy owner they had heard so much about. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the economic spectrum, in a small weathered house that sat on 2 acres of rocky land that nobody else wanted, lived a boy named Ethan Cole. At 14 years old, Ethan had already experienced more hardship than most people twice his age. His father had died in a mining accident when Ethan was only 7, leaving behind a widow and 3 children who struggled to survive on the meager compensation the mining company provided. His mother, Sarah, worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, leaving early each morning and returning late each night with exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Ethan's older brother had joined the military the moment he turned 18, sending home what little money he could spare, while his younger sister helped their grandmother, who lived in a cramped room at the back of the house. Ethan himself had taken on responsibilities that no 14-year-old should have to bear. He woke before dawn each morning to tend to the small collection of animals they kept: 2 chickens, an elderly goat, and a donkey named Pepper, who had been rescued from a neighbor who could no longer afford to feed him. After caring for the animals, Ethan walked 3 miles to school, then 3 miles back, often stopping along the way to do odd jobs for neighbors who could spare a few dollars. He mowed lawns, carried groceries, cleaned gutters, and did whatever else was asked of him, handing every cent he earned to his mother without complaint. Despite his circumstances, there was something remarkable about Ethan that anyone who met him could sense immediately. He possessed a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from within, a patience and gentleness that was unusual for someone his age. Animals, in particular, seemed drawn to him in ways that defied explanation. Stray dogs would follow him home. Wild birds would land near him without fear. The old donkey Pepper, who had been considered impossible to handle by his previous owner, had become as docile as a lamb under Ethan's care. The boy had a gift, though he himself was too humble to recognize it as such. He simply loved animals and treated them with the same respect and compassion he wished the world would show to his struggling family. It was Ethan's grandmother, a woman named Eleanor, who had lived through the Great Depression and carried its lessons in her bones, who first heard about the $50,000 reward. She had been at the general store picking up flour and sugar for the week's baking when she overheard 2 women discussing Richard Hartwell's desperate offer. Her ears perked up at the mention of the sum, and she listened intently as the women gossiped about all the experts who had failed to cure the famous horse. That evening, as the family gathered around their modest dinner table, Eleanor mentioned what she had heard, her eyes fixed meaningfully on her grandson as she spoke about the lame horse and the fortune waiting for whoever could heal him. Ethan looked up from his plate of beans and cornbread, his fork frozen midway to his mouth as his grandmother finished speaking. The amount of money she had mentioned seemed almost unreal to him, like something from a fairy tale rather than actual life. $50,000 was an inconceivable sum in his world, where his family celebrated when they could afford meat twice in the same week. He tried to imagine what such wealth would mean for his mother, who came home each night with her feet swollen and her back aching from standing for hours at the diner. He thought of his sister, who wore shoes with holes in them because new ones were a luxury they could not justify. He thought of his grandmother, whose medicine sometimes went unpurchased, when the budget would not stretch far enough. His mother, Sarah, noticed the look in her son's eyes and quickly shook her head. She knew Ethan better than anyone, understood the way his mind worked, and the impossible dreams that sometimes took root there. She had watched him bring home injured birds and nurture them back to health, had seen him calm frightened animals with nothing more than his presence and his gentle voice. But this was different. This was a rich man's horse, a valuable animal that the best veterinarians in the country had failed to heal. The thought of her son walking onto Richard Hartwell's property and offering his services was both touching and terrifying. Richard Hartwell was not known for his kindness toward those he considered beneath him, and Sarah could not bear the thought of her boy being humiliated by a man who measured worth in dollars. But Eleanor, the grandmother who had survived hardships that would have broken lesser souls, saw something different in her grandson's eyes. She saw potential, the same potential she had recognized in him since he was old enough to toddle after the farm animals. There was a gift in that boy, something that could not be taught or bought, something that came from a place deeper than education or training. She had watched him with animals all his life and had seen things that defied rational explanation. Horses that bucked and kicked for everyone else would stand calm and still for Ethan. Dogs that had been abused and feared human contact would crawl into his lap and fall asleep. If anyone could help that injured horse, Eleanor believed with all her heart that it was her grandson. The discussion that followed dinner stretched long into the evening. Sarah voiced her objections, her fears about her son being rejected and ridiculed by people who saw their family as nothing more than poor country folk. She worried about what failure would do to Ethan's spirit, about how crushing it would be to try his best and still fall short. But Eleanor countered each argument with the quiet wisdom of her years. She reminded Sarah that every great achievement in history had been accomplished by someone willing to try when others said it was impossible. She spoke of the money, yes, but also of something more important. She spoke of Ethan finding his purpose, of him discovering what he was truly capable of when given the chance. Ethan himself sat quietly through most of the discussion, listening to his mother and grandmother debate his future. When they finally turned to him and asked what he wanted to do, he answered with a simplicity that silenced them both. He said that he had to try. He said that if there was even the smallest chance he could help that horse, he would never forgive himself for not attempting it. The money would change their lives, that much was true. But there was something else driving him, something he could not fully articulate. He felt called to that injured animal in a way that transcended logic, as if an invisible thread connected him to a horse he had never met, pulling him toward a destiny he did not yet understand. The next morning, Ethan rose before the sun, as was his habit. He fed the chickens, milked the goat, and spent extra time with Pepper the donkey, explaining in soft whispers that he would be gone for a while but would return as soon as he could. Pepper nudged him affectionately, as if offering his blessing for the journey ahead. Ethan's grandmother had packed him a small bag with food for the trip and a change of clothes, along with a few dollars that she had been saving for emergencies. His mother stood on the porch as he prepared to leave, her eyes red from a night of worried tears. She hugged him tightly and told him to be careful, to remember his manners, and to come home immediately if anyone treated him poorly. Ethan promised he would, kissed her cheek, and began the long walk toward the Hartwell Ranch. The journey took most of the day. The Hartwell property was nearly 15 miles from Ethan's home, and he covered the distance on foot, having no other means of transportation. He walked along dusty roads that wound through farmland and forest, past properties that ranged from modest homesteads to sprawling estates. As he drew closer to his destination, the wealth of the area became increasingly apparent. The fences grew taller and more ornate. The houses became mansions. The cars parked in driveways cost more than everything his family owned combined. Ethan felt increasingly small as he approached the world of Richard Hartwell, but he did not turn back. With each step, he reminded himself of why he had come and who was waiting for him at home, counting on him to succeed. When the gates of the Hartwell Ranch finally came into view, Ethan stopped and stared in disbelief. The entrance alone was more impressive than any building he had ever seen, with massive stone pillars topped by bronze statues of rearing horses. A paved driveway stretched beyond the gates, disappearing over a hill toward what Ethan could only imagine was the main house. Signs warned against trespassing and announced that the property was under constant surveillance. For a moment, Ethan's courage wavered. He was just a poor boy in worn clothes and dusty shoes, carrying a bag that his grandmother had patched more times than he could count. What right did he have to walk through those gates and offer his help to a man like Richard Hartwell? But then he thought of Thunder, the horse whose story had reached even the poorest corners of the county. He thought of an animal in pain, suffering despite all the wealth that surrounded him. Ethan understood suffering. He understood what it meant to feel helpless and forgotten. And in that moment of connection with a creature he had never met, he found the courage to approach the intercom mounted beside the gate, press the button with a trembling finger, and announce his presence to whoever might be listening on the other end. The intercom crackled to life with a harsh static sound that made Ethan jump slightly. A voice, gruff and impatient, demanded to know who was there and what business they had at the Hartwell Ranch. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as sandpaper, and explained that he had come about the horse, about the reward that had been advertised for anyone who could help cure the injured animal. There was a long pause, so long that Ethan wondered if the person on the other end had simply walked away and forgotten about him. Then the voice returned, carrying a tone of barely concealed amusement, asking Ethan his age and whether he was some kind of veterinarian or specialist. When Ethan admitted that he was 14 years old and had no formal training whatsoever, the laughter that came through the speaker was sharp enough to cut. The voice told him to go home, to stop wasting everyone's time, to find some other way to chase childish dreams of easy money. Ethan felt heat rise to his cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and frustration that threatened to overwhelm him. But he did not leave. Instead, he pressed the button again and spoke with a calm determination that surprised even himself. He said that the advertisement had made no mention of age requirements or professional credentials. He said that he had walked 15 miles to be there and was not leaving until he had at least been given the chance to see the horse. He said that Richard Hartwell had nothing to lose by letting him try, since everyone else had already failed. The intercom went silent again, and Ethan stood waiting, his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Several minutes passed before the massive gates began to swing open with a mechanical hum. Ethan could hardly believe his eyes as the path to the Hartwell Ranch revealed itself before him. He stepped through the entrance and began walking up the paved driveway, his worn shoes making soft sounds against the immaculate surface. The property that unfolded around him was like something from a magazine, with manicured lawns stretching in every direction and horses grazing in paddocks that seemed to extend toward infinity. Workers paused in their tasks to watch the strange boy walking toward the main complex, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright skepticism. Ethan kept his eyes forward and his shoulders straight, refusing to let their stares diminish his resolve. The main stable was a structure larger than any building in Cedar Falls, constructed from stone and timber that spoke of permanence and wealth. Standing outside its entrance was a group of ranch hands, along with a middle-aged man in work clothes who introduced himself as Marcus, the head trainer. Marcus looked Ethan up and down with an expression that suggested he was evaluating livestock rather than a human being. He asked if Ethan was the boy from the intercom, the one who thought he could succeed where doctors and specialists had failed. When Ethan confirmed that he was, Marcus shook his head slowly and muttered something under his breath about desperate times and foolish hopes. But orders were orders, and apparently someone higher up the chain had decided to give Ethan his chance. Marcus led the boy through the stable, past stalls housing horses whose combined value exceeded what most people earned in a lifetime. Ethan tried not to gawk at the magnificent animals, focusing instead on the task ahead. He could feel something in the air as they walked deeper into the building, a heaviness that seemed to increase with each step. The other horses grew quieter as they approached one particular stall at the far end, as if they knew they were nearing something sacred, something broken. Thunder stood alone in a stall twice the size of any other, his once magnificent form now diminished by months of suffering and failed treatments. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he laid eyes on the horse for the first time. Even in his weakened state, Thunder possessed a beauty that was impossible to ignore. His chestnut coat, though dulled by illness, still held hints of the copper brilliance that had once made him famous. His eyes, large and dark as midnight pools, turned toward Ethan with an expression that seemed to ask why yet another stranger had come to prod and poke at his injured body. Marcus opened the stall door and gestured for Ethan to enter, his expression making clear that he expected the boy to fail just as everyone else had. Some of the ranch hands had gathered nearby, whispering among themselves and placing bets on how long the kid would last before giving up. Ethan ignored them all. He stepped into the stall slowly, making no sudden movements, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. Thunder watched him approach with wary resignation, his ears flicking back and forth as he assessed this new visitor. Ethan stopped several feet away from the horse and simply stood there, breathing slowly and evenly. He made no attempt to touch Thunder, no attempt to examine his injured leg or demonstrate any kind of expertise. He simply existed in the same space as the horse, offering his presence without demanding anything in return. The minutes stretched on, and the watching ranch hands grew restless, murmuring about wasted time and silly children. But Ethan remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Thunder with a patience that seemed almost inhuman for someone his age. Something shifted in the atmosphere of the stall. Thunder, who had grown accustomed to flinching away from human contact, took a tentative step toward the strange boy who asked nothing of him. His nostrils flared as he sniffed the air, catching Ethan's scent and finding in it something that his instincts recognized as safe. Another step brought him closer, then another, until his muzzle was mere inches from Ethan's outstretched hand. The boy still did not move, did not grab or clutch or force contact. He simply waited, allowing the horse to make the choice on his own terms. When Thunder finally pressed his nose against Ethan's palm, a collective gasp rose from the observers. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. In all the months since the injury, Thunder had refused to let anyone approach him willingly. He had tolerated examinations with resigned suffering, had submitted to treatments with dull acceptance, but never once had he sought out human contact. Yet here he was, leaning into the touch of a 14-year-old boy with no credentials and no experience, as if he had found something he had been searching for all along. Word of what had happened in Thunder's stall spread through the ranch like wildfire carried on a summer wind. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, everyone from the lowest stable hand to the household staff had heard about the boy who had made Thunder approach willingly. Some dismissed it as coincidence, a lucky moment that meant nothing in the grand scheme of the horse's recovery. Others whispered that perhaps there was something special about the ragged teenager who had walked 15 miles for a chance to help. But regardless of what anyone believed, the event had attracted the attention of the one person whose opinion mattered most on the Hartwell Ranch. Richard Hartwell had been in his study when Marcus came to deliver the news, his voice carrying an excitement that the head trainer rarely displayed. Richard listened without expression, his weathered face revealing nothing of the emotions churning beneath the surface. He had heard similar reports before, from specialists who claimed breakthroughs that never materialized, and healers who promised miracles that never came. Yet something in Marcus's tone was different this time, a genuine bewilderment that could not be faked. Richard rose from his chair, placed his gray Stetson on his head, and walked out to see this supposed miracle worker for himself. What he found when he reached Thunder's stall stopped him in his tracks. Ethan was sitting on the straw-covered floor, his back against the wooden wall, speaking softly to Thunder in a voice too quiet for anyone outside to hear. The horse stood beside him, his head lowered so that his muzzle nearly touched the boy's shoulder. There was a peace in that stall that Richard had not witnessed in months, a calm that seemed to emanate from the unlikely pair and fill the space around them. For a long moment, Richard simply watched, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he thought he knew about horses and healing and the way the world worked. When Richard finally stepped into view, Ethan rose respectfully to his feet, his eyes meeting those of the wealthy rancher without flinching. Richard studied the boy before him, taking in the patched clothes, the dusty shoes, the calloused hands that spoke of hard work and harder circumstances. He saw poverty, yes, but he also saw something else, a quiet dignity that wealth could not purchase and hardship had not destroyed. Richard asked the boy his name, and Ethan answered simply, without embellishment or attempt to impress. He explained that he had come because of the reward, yes, but also because he believed he might be able to help where others had failed. Richard's first instinct was to dismiss the boy as he had dismissed so many before him. What could a child know about healing a horse that trained veterinarians did not? What expertise could poverty possibly offer that wealth had not already purchased? But as he opened his mouth to send Ethan away, Thunder did something that silenced every objection before it could be voiced. The horse stepped closer to Ethan, positioning himself between the boy and Richard in a gesture that seemed almost protective. In 7 years of ownership, Richard had never seen Thunder display such clear preference for anyone. The horse had always been professional, allowing handling but never seeking connection. What he was witnessing now was something entirely different. Against his better judgment, Richard found himself offering Ethan a chance. He told the boy that he could stay for 1 week, during which time he would have access to Thunder and any supplies he might need. If there was no improvement by the end of that period, Ethan would leave and never return. But if by some miracle the boy succeeded where everyone else had failed, the $50,000 would be his. Richard expected gratitude, perhaps groveling appreciation for the opportunity. What he received instead was a simple nod and a quiet thank you, as if Ethan had never doubted that this moment would come. That first night, Ethan refused the offer of a room in the ranch's guest quarters. Instead, he asked permission to sleep in the stable near Thunder's stall. Marcus thought the request was absurd, but Richard, curious despite himself, allowed it. He provided the boy with blankets and a pillow, watching as Ethan made himself a modest bed in the straw just outside Thunder's door. As darkness fell over the ranch and the other workers retired to their homes, Ethan remained with Thunder, speaking to him in low tones that carried through the quiet night air like prayers offered to a listening universe. The first day of work began before dawn. Ethan rose with the earliest light, splashed water on his face from a nearby trough, and entered Thunder's stall with the same calm patience he had displayed the day before. He did not immediately focus on the injured leg as every other healer had done. Instead, he spent hours simply being with Thunder, grooming his coat with gentle strokes, cleaning his hooves with careful attention, treating the horse not as a patient to be fixed, but as a friend to be cherished. The ranch hands watched with growing confusion, wondering when the boy would actually begin his treatment. They did not understand that for Ethan, this was the treatment, the building of trust that had to precede any physical healing. By midday, Ethan finally turned his attention to Thunder's injured leg. He knelt beside the horse with movements so slow and deliberate that they seemed almost ceremonial. His hands hovered over the swollen area, not yet touching, simply feeling the heat that radiated from the damaged tissue. Thunder watched him with an alertness that was different from fear, a curiosity about what this strange boy intended to do. When Ethan finally made contact, his fingers pressing gently against the leg, Thunder flinched slightly, but did not pull away. It was a small victory, but Ethan understood that small victories were the foundation upon which larger ones were built. Richard observed from a distance, his presence unnoticed by the boy who was completely absorbed in his work. He watched as Ethan began to massage the injured leg with techniques that seemed entirely self-taught, intuitive movements that followed the contours of muscle and tendon. There was no scientific method to what the boy was doing, no established protocol or proven procedure. Yet there was something undeniably purposeful about his movements, as if his hands knew things that his mind had never been taught. Richard felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he had long ago learned to suppress. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that the ranch had never witnessed before. Ethan woke each morning before anyone else, his internal clock tuned to the needs of the animal in his care, rather than the expectations of those around him. He would enter Thunder's stall as the first gray light of dawn crept through the stable windows, greeting the horse with soft words and gentle touches that had become their morning ritual. Thunder, who had spent months retreating into himself, began to show signs of emergence. His ears perked forward when he heard Ethan's footsteps approaching. His eyes, once dull with pain and resignation, began to hold a spark that the ranch hands noticed with growing amazement. Ethan's approach to healing was unlike anything the specialists had attempted. While they had focused exclusively on the physical injury, treating Thunder as a collection of tendons and bones to be repaired, Ethan treated him as a complete being whose spirit needed mending as much as his leg. He spent hours talking to the horse, sharing stories from his own life as if Thunder could understand every word. He told Thunder about his father, about the accident that had stolen him from their family, and the empty chair at the dinner table that still made his mother cry some nights. He spoke of his grandmother's strength, his sister's laughter, his mother's sacrifice. In sharing his own pain, Ethan seemed to be telling Thunder that suffering was not something to face alone. The physical therapy that Ethan developed came from observation and instinct rather than textbooks or training. He had watched his grandmother treat injured animals on their small farm, using techniques passed down through generations of people who could not afford veterinarians. He remembered how she would use warm compresses made from herbs gathered in the fields, how she would massage cramped muscles with oils extracted from plants that grew wild along the roadside. These methods, dismissed by modern medicine as folk remedies without scientific basis, became the foundation of Ethan's treatment plan. He gathered herbs from the edges of the Hartwell property, prepared poultices in the stable's small kitchen, and applied them to Thunder's leg with the reverence of a priest performing sacred rites. Marcus, the head trainer, found himself checking on Ethan's progress more frequently than his duties required. What he saw challenged everything he thought he knew about horses and healing. Thunder was moving more freely, putting weight on his injured leg in ways he had refused to do for months. The swelling had begun to decrease, slowly but visibly, as if Ethan's hands possessed some power that expensive equipment could not replicate. Marcus had worked with horses his entire adult life and had never seen anything quite like what was unfolding before his eyes. He began to treat the boy with a respect that surprised the other ranch hands, offering assistance and advice instead of the skepticism he had initially displayed. Richard Hartwell maintained his distance during those first days, watching from afar through windows and doorways, never directly involving himself in what was happening. He told himself that he was simply protecting his investment, monitoring the situation to ensure that no harm came to his valuable horse. But the truth was more complex than he cared to admit. Something about the boy unsettled him, challenged the assumptions upon which he had built his entire life. Richard had always believed that excellence required resources, that achievement was purchased through wealth and connections, and the best that money could buy. Yet here was a child from poverty accomplishing what his millions had failed to achieve, and Richard did not know how to reconcile that reality with his worldview. On the fourth day, Richard finally approached Ethan directly. He found the boy in Thunder's stall, carefully wrapping the injured leg with bandages soaked in one of his homemade preparations. The smell of herbs filled the air, earthy and sharp, completely different from the antiseptic odors that had accompanied the professional treatments. Richard stood in the doorway and asked Ethan where he had learned to do what he was doing. The boy's answer was simple and honest. He said that he had learned by watching, by paying attention to animals and understanding what they needed. He said that healing was not about forcing recovery, but about creating conditions where recovery could happen naturally. Richard found himself sitting on a hay bale, listening as Ethan explained his philosophy while continuing to work on Thunder's leg. The boy spoke without arrogance or pretension, sharing his thoughts as easily as he might discuss the weather. He talked about how animals communicated through body language and energy, how fear and pain created tension that prevented healing, how trust had to be established before any physical treatment could be effective. Richard, who was accustomed to experts speaking in jargon designed to impress and intimidate, found himself genuinely understanding what Ethan was saying. More than that, he found himself believing it. That evening, Richard invited Ethan to dinner at the main house, an invitation that shocked the household staff who had prepared the meal. They watched in disbelief as the wealthy rancher sat across from the poor boy, sharing food and conversation as if they were equals. Richard asked about Ethan's family, about his life, about the circumstances that had shaped him into the person he was. Ethan answered honestly without self-pity or attempts to gain sympathy. He spoke of hardship the way one might speak of weather, as a fact of life to be endured, rather than a tragedy to be mourned. Richard found himself moved in ways he had not experienced in years. The conversation eventually turned to Thunder and the progress Ethan had made. Richard admitted that he was impressed, that he had not expected such results from anyone, let alone a 14-year-old with no formal training. Ethan accepted the compliment graciously, but redirected credit to Thunder himself. He said that the horse wanted to heal, that the spirit within him had never been broken despite all he had suffered. All Ethan had done was give Thunder a reason to fight, a connection that made recovery worth pursuing. Richard sat in silence after those words, staring at the boy across the table and seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. When Ethan returned to the stable that night, he found Thunder waiting for him at the stall door. The horse nickered softly as the boy approached, a sound of greeting and affection that echoed through the quiet building. Ethan smiled and pressed his forehead against Thunder's neck, breathing in the warm animal scent that had become as familiar as home. The fifth day brought an unexpected visitor to the Hartwell Ranch. A gleaming black sedan rolled through the gates and up the driveway, depositing a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Dr. Harrison Webb, one of the country's most renowned equine surgeons. He had heard about Richard's ongoing struggle with Thunder and had flown in from Kentucky specifically to offer his services. His credentials were impeccable, his reputation unimpeachable, and his fee was astronomical. He strode into the stable with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem his expertise could not solve, fully expecting to take over Thunder's care and finally deliver the results that had eluded everyone else. What Dr. Webb found in Thunder's stall stopped him mid-stride. There was Ethan, a teenager in worn clothes, kneeling beside the championship horse and applying what appeared to be mud mixed with leaves to the injured leg. The sight was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Dr. Webb believed about proper veterinary care, that he actually laughed out loud. He turned to Richard, who had accompanied him to the stable, and asked if this was some kind of joke. Surely the great Richard Hartwell had not resorted to folk medicine and children to treat his prize stallion. The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard's response surprised everyone, including himself. He told Dr. Webb that Ethan had accomplished more in 5 days than all the specialists had achieved in months. He pointed to Thunder, who was standing calmly beside the boy, weight distributed more evenly across all 4 legs than it had been since the injury. He noted the reduced swelling, the improved demeanor, the spark of life that had returned to the horse's eyes. Dr. Webb examined Thunder with grudging professionalism, his skepticism gradually giving way to genuine confusion as he noted the improvements that even his trained eye could not deny. When he demanded to know what treatment protocol Ethan was following, the boy simply shrugged and said he was doing what felt right. The confrontation that followed was inevitable. Dr. Webb insisted that proper medical intervention was still necessary, that whatever temporary improvement Thunder had shown would not last without scientific treatment. He proposed surgery to repair the damaged tendon, a procedure he had performed successfully on dozens of horses. He spoke of recovery rates and long-term prognosis, of reputation and legacy, of everything that a horse of Thunder's caliber deserved. His arguments were logical, supported by evidence and experience, delivered with the certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering his craft. Against such expertise, what could a poor boy with his grandmother's remedies possibly offer? Ethan listened to Dr. Webb's presentation without interrupting, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. When the surgeon finished speaking, Ethan asked a simple question that hung in the air like a challenge. He asked whether any of the previous treatments had considered what Thunder himself wanted, whether anyone had bothered to understand the horse's spirit before attempting to fix his body. Dr. Webb dismissed the question as sentimental nonsense, irrelevant to the serious business of medical treatment. But Richard, who had spent the past few days watching Ethan work, heard something profound in the boy's words. He remembered all the specialists who had treated Thunder as a problem to be solved rather than a being to be understood, and he wondered if that approach had been the problem all along. The decision Richard made in that moment would be discussed throughout the county for years to come. He thanked Dr. Webb for his time and expertise, paid him generously for his consultation, and sent him back to Kentucky without performing any procedures. The surgeon left in a state of offended disbelief, warning Richard that he was making a terrible mistake by trusting his horse's recovery to an untrained child. But Richard had made his choice, and it was one that felt right in a way that none of his previous decisions regarding Thunder had felt. He was betting on Ethan, on instinct over expertise, on heart over credentials. It was a gamble that went against everything he had ever believed about success. That night, after Dr. Webb's departure, Richard sat with Ethan in the stable and had the most honest conversation of his life. He spoke about his past, about the poverty he had escaped through ruthless ambition and relentless work. He confessed that he had spent so many years accumulating wealth that he had forgotten what truly mattered, that he had measured his worth in dollars and trophies rather than relationships and kindness. Thunder's injury had stripped away his illusions, forcing him to confront the emptiness at the core of his success. All his money had been powerless to help the creature he loved, and that powerlessness had broken something inside him. Ethan listened with the same patience he showed Thunder, offering no judgment and no platitudes. When Richard finished speaking, the boy shared his own perspective on wealth and poverty. He said that his family had never had much money, but they had always had each other. He spoke of his mother's sacrifices, his grandmother's wisdom, his sister's joy despite their circumstances. He explained that growing up poor had taught him to value what could not be bought, to find richness in connections rather than possessions. It was a philosophy that Richard had never considered, and it resonated with something deep within him that had been dormant for decades. The sixth day dawned bright and clear, and with it came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Ethan led Thunder out of his stall for the first time since the injury, guiding him with nothing more than a gentle hand on his neck. The ranch hands gathered to watch, their breath held collectively as Thunder took his first steps into the paddock. The horse moved cautiously at first, testing his injured leg with each stride, but there was a confidence in his movement that had been absent for months. Ethan walked beside him, murmuring encouragement, his presence a steady anchor in the sea of watching eyes. Then Thunder began to trot, and gasps erupted from the assembled crowd. His gait was not perfect. There was still a slight hesitation in his stride, but he was moving freely, without the pronounced limp that had become his defining characteristic. Richard watched from the fence, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he witnessed the miracle unfolding before him. His horse, his beloved Thunder, was healing, and it was all because of a 14-year-old boy who had walked 15 miles for a chance to help. News of Thunder's recovery spread through Cedar Falls and beyond, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. People who had followed the story from the beginning, who had watched the parade of experts come and go without success, could hardly believe what they were hearing. A 14-year-old boy from one of the poorest families in the county had accomplished what the best veterinarians in the country could not. Some called it luck, others called it a miracle, but those who had witnessed Ethan's work firsthand knew it was something else entirely. It was a gift, a connection between human and animal that transcended ordinary understanding, and it had saved a horse that everyone else had given up on. The seventh day arrived, marking the end of the trial period that Richard had initially granted. But there was no longer any question about whether Ethan had earned the reward. Thunder's improvement was undeniable, documented not just by the observations of ranch hands, but by the veterinarian who had been summoned to provide an official assessment. The doctor examined Thunder with meticulous care, running tests and taking measurements, comparing his current condition to the records from months earlier. When he finally delivered his verdict, his voice carried a disbelief that matched what everyone present was feeling. Thunder was healing. The tendon that had been declared permanently damaged was regenerating in ways that medical science could not fully explain. Richard called a gathering that afternoon, assembling the ranch staff and inviting several prominent members of the community to witness what he was about to do. The crowd gathered in front of the main stable, their faces expectant as they waited for the wealthy rancher to speak. Richard stood before them in his gray Stetson, but there was something different about his bearing, a humility that had replaced the arrogance everyone had known for so long. Beside him stood Ethan, looking uncomfortable with all the attention but standing straight nonetheless, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the stable where Thunder waited. Richard began to speak, his voice carrying across the crowd with a clarity that demanded attention. He talked about Thunder, about the injury that had devastated him and the months of failed treatments that had followed. He spoke of his desperation, of the reward he had offered in hopes that someone, anyone, could help his beloved horse. Then he turned to Ethan and described what the boy had accomplished. Not just the physical healing, but the restoration of Thunder's spirit, the return of the fire that had made him a champion. His words were not the polished phrases of a businessman making a presentation, but the honest testimony of a man who had witnessed something that had changed him forever. When Richard produced the check, the crowd fell silent. $50,000, written in neat figures, made out to Ethan Cole. It was a fortune by any standard, life-changing money for a family that had struggled to afford basic necessities. Richard handed the check to Ethan with both hands, a gesture of respect that was not lost on those watching. He thanked the boy not just for saving Thunder, but for teaching him lessons that all his wealth had never provided. He spoke of the value of patience, of trust, of seeing others as complete beings rather than problems to be solved. These were gifts, Richard said, worth far more than any amount of money. Ethan accepted the check with trembling hands, his eyes glistening with tears he did not try to hide. He thought of his mother, who would finally be able to rest, who would no longer have to work 2 jobs just to keep their family fed. He thought of his grandmother, whose medicine would never again go unpurchased. He thought of his sister, who would have new shoes and books and all the things that other children took for granted. The weight of the check in his hands was the weight of their salvation, and for a moment, Ethan was too overwhelmed to speak. When he finally found his voice, Ethan's words were simple but powerful. He thanked Richard for the opportunity, for believing in him when no one else would have. He thanked Marcus and the ranch hands who had helped him gather supplies and offered advice despite their initial skepticism. But most of all, he thanked Thunder, the horse who had trusted him when trust must have seemed impossible, who had fought to heal when giving up would have been so much easier. Without Thunder's courage, Ethan said, none of this would have been possible. The healing had been a partnership, a collaboration between human and animal, and the credit belonged to both of them. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the Hartwell Ranch had ever seen. Richard, in a gesture that shocked everyone who knew him, opened his property to the entire community. Tables were set up on the lawn, laden with food prepared by the ranch's kitchen staff. Music played from speakers mounted on the porch, and people danced and laughed and marveled at the change that had come over their once distant neighbor. Richard moved through the crowd with a lightness that seemed foreign to his nature, shaking hands and sharing smiles with people he had barely acknowledged before. It was as if Ethan had healed not just Thunder, but something broken in Richard himself. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ethan slipped away from the celebration and made his way to Thunder's stall. The horse was waiting for him, as he always seemed to be, his head turned toward the door in anticipation. Ethan entered the stall and wrapped his arms around Thunder's neck, breathing in the familiar scent that had become so dear to him over the past week. He whispered promises into the horse's ear, vows to return and visit, to never forget the bond they had formed. Thunder nickered softly in response, his breath warm against Ethan's shoulder. Richard found them there some time later, standing together in the fading light. He watched from the doorway, not wanting to interrupt the private moment between boy and horse. But Ethan sensed his presence and turned, his face illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun. There was no awkwardness between them now, no barrier of wealth or status. They were simply 2 people who shared a love for the magnificent animal before them, connected by an experience that had transformed them both. Richard made an offer then, one that would change everything once again. He asked Ethan if he would consider staying on at the ranch, not as an employee but as Thunder's primary caretaker. The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and profound. Richard explained that he had been thinking about it all week, watching how Ethan worked with Thunder, observing the transformation that had occurred in both the horse and himself. He said that Thunder needed someone who understood him, someone who could continue the work that had begun and ensure that the recovery was complete. The ranch could provide Ethan with housing, education, and a salary that would support his entire family. It was an opportunity that most people would accept without hesitation, a chance to escape poverty and step into a life of comfort and security. Ethan stood in silence, his hands still resting on Thunder's neck, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. A week ago, he had been a poor boy walking dusty roads with nothing but hope and determination. Now he was being offered a future that exceeded anything he had ever dared to dream. The rational part of his mind screamed to accept immediately, to seize this opportunity before it could be withdrawn. But another part, the part that had carried him through 14 years of hardship and struggle, urged caution. He thought of his family, of his mother and grandmother and sister waiting for him at home, and he knew that any decision he made would affect them as profoundly as it affected him. He asked Richard for time to think, explaining that he needed to discuss the offer with his family before he could give an answer. Richard nodded with understanding, remembering the boy's descriptions of his mother's sacrifices and his grandmother's wisdom. He told Ethan to take as long as he needed, that the offer would remain open regardless of how long the decision took. Then he left the stable, granting Ethan privacy to process everything that had happened. The boy remained with Thunder long into the night, speaking softly to the horse about his hopes and fears, seeking guidance from the only friend who had shared this incredible journey with him. The next morning, Ethan began the long walk home, the check tucked safely in his pocket and Richard's offer weighing heavily on his mind. The journey that had seemed so daunting a week ago now felt almost meditative, giving him time to organize his thoughts before facing his family. He passed through the same landscapes he had traveled before, but everything looked different now. The farm seemed more vibrant, the forests more alive, as if the world itself had been transformed by his experience. Or perhaps it was Ethan who had been transformed, his eyes opened to beauty that had always been there but which he had been too burdened to see. When he finally reached his small, weathered house, his family was waiting on the porch. His mother saw him first and ran to meet him, wrapping him in an embrace so tight that it squeezed the air from his lungs. His grandmother followed more slowly, her aged face breaking into a smile that seemed to shed years from her appearance. Even his younger sister joined the celebration, dancing around them with the unbridled joy of a child who does not yet understand the full significance of the moment. They had received word of his success through the community grapevine, and they had been counting the hours until his return. The presentation of the check was a moment Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. He placed it in his mother's hands and watched as she stared at the figures, her lips moving silently, as if she could not believe what her eyes were telling her. $50,000. It was more money than she had earned in the past decade of backbreaking work. She began to cry, not the tears of exhaustion that Ethan had seen so many times, but tears of relief, of joy, of a burden finally lifted after years of crushing weight. She held her son and wept, thanking God and fate and whatever forces had guided her boy to that ranch and that horse. That evening, gathered around their modest dinner table for a meal that suddenly felt like a feast, Ethan shared Richard's offer with his family. He explained everything: the housing, the education, the salary, the opportunity to continue working with Thunder. He watched their faces as they processed the information, saw the conflict between excitement and concern that mirrored his own feelings. His mother's first instinct was to refuse, to keep her son close and protect him from a world that had already taken so much from their family. But his grandmother, wise Eleanor, who had guided them through so many difficulties, saw something different in the offer. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood their weight. She said that opportunities like this came once in a lifetime, if they came at all. She reminded Sarah that Ethan had proven himself capable of things that grown men could not accomplish, that he possessed a gift that deserved to be nurtured and developed. Keeping him home out of fear would be selfish, she argued, a disservice to the remarkable young man he was becoming. The money he had earned would provide for them, and the position at the ranch would ensure their security for years to come. It was not a separation, but an expansion, a chance for Ethan to grow while still remaining connected to the family he loved. The discussion continued late into the night, with arguments made and concerns addressed and compromises proposed. By the time the moon reached its highest point in the sky, a decision had been reached. Ethan would accept Richard's offer, but with conditions that protected his connection to his family. He would return home every weekend, maintaining his presence in their lives even as he built his future at the ranch. The salary he earned would go directly to his mother, ensuring that she could finally reduce her working hours and spend more time with her family. And most importantly, his grandmother would visit the ranch regularly, offering her wisdom and ensuring that Ethan never forgot where he came from. Ethan returned to the Hartwell Ranch 3 days later, carrying a small bag containing everything he owned and a heart full of determination. Richard met him at the gate personally, greeting him not as an employee, but as something closer to family. The accommodations prepared for Ethan were modest by the ranch's standards, but luxurious beyond anything the boy had ever known. A clean room with a comfortable bed, a desk for studying, windows that looked out over the paddocks where Thunder grazed. It was perfect in its simplicity, a space where Ethan could grow while remaining true to himself. Thunder's reaction to Ethan's permanent arrival was immediate and unmistakable. The horse seemed to sense that this was not another temporary visit, that the boy who had saved him was now staying for good. He nickered loudly when Ethan entered the stable, pressing his nose against the boy's chest in a gesture of welcome and affection that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. The months that followed were a testament to the power of patience, dedication, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his horse. Under Ethan's continued care, Thunder's recovery progressed beyond what anyone had dared to hope. The limp that had once defined him disappeared entirely, replaced by the fluid grace that had made him a champion. His coat regained its copper brilliance, gleaming in the sunlight like polished metal. His eyes, once dulled by pain and resignation, now sparkled with the fire of a spirit fully restored. The veterinarians who examined him could find no trace of the injury that had nearly ended his life, and they documented his recovery in medical journals as a case that defied conventional explanation. Richard Hartwell watched this transformation with a sense of wonder that never diminished. The man who had once measured worth in dollars and victories now found his greatest joy in simply watching Ethan and Thunder together. He had restructured his priorities in ways that shocked everyone who knew him, delegating business responsibilities to focus on the ranch and the relationships he had neglected for so long. He became a fixture at community events, donating generously to local causes and offering employment to those who needed it most. The people of Cedar Falls, who had once viewed him with suspicion and resentment, began to see him differently. They saw a man who had been changed by a 14-year-old boy and a horse, and they welcomed the transformation with open arms. Ethan flourished in his new environment, growing from a boy into a young man whose reputation spread far beyond the boundaries of the county. Richard hired tutors to supplement his education, ensuring that Ethan's mind developed as fully as his gift with animals. The boy proved to be a quick study, absorbing knowledge with the same patience and determination he applied to everything else. But his true classroom remained the stable, where he continued to work with Thunder and began helping with other horses on the ranch. Word of his abilities attracted visitors from across the state, owners of injured or troubled animals who had heard about the miracle worker of Hartwell Ranch and came seeking his help. His family thrived as well, their circumstances transformed by the $50,000 and the ongoing salary that Ethan sent home. Sarah finally quit her second job, spending her newfound free time with her daughter and mother. The old house received repairs that had been postponed for years, and the small farm expanded with new animals that brought joy rather than burden. Grandmother Eleanor, true to the arrangement, visited the ranch regularly, her presence a grounding force that kept Ethan connected to his roots. She sat with Richard during these visits, the two of them sharing stories and wisdom across the divide of their different backgrounds. finding common ground in their love for the remarkable boy who had brought them together. 1 year after Ethan first walked through the gates of the Hartwell Ranch, Richard organized an event that would become legendary in local history. He announced that Thunder would return to the racing circuit, not to compete, but to demonstrate his recovery to the world. The news attracted attention from across the country, and on the appointed day, the ranch was filled with journalists, horse enthusiasts, and curious spectators who wanted to witness the miracle for themselves. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation as people gathered around the track that had been prepared for the occasion. When Thunder emerged from the stable with Ethan walking beside him, the crowd fell silent. The horse moved with a majesty that seemed almost supernatural, his muscles rippling beneath his gleaming coat, his head held high with the pride of a champion restored. Ethan guided him to the starting line and then stepped back, giving Thunder the space to show the world what he had become. For a moment, horse and boy locked eyes, communicating in the silent language they had developed over months of working together. Then Thunder turned toward the track, his body tensing with the anticipation of a runner about to fly. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. Thunder exploded from the starting line with a power that seemed to shake the very earth beneath him. His hooves pounded the track in a rhythm that built to a thunderous crescendo, carrying him around the circuit with a speed that defied his history. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising to match the glory of what they were witnessing. Richard stood at the fence with tears streaming down his face, watching his beloved horse reclaim the magnificence that injury had stolen. And Ethan, the poor boy who had walked 15 miles for a chance to help, watched with quiet satisfaction as Thunder crossed the finish line in a time that would have won championships. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, but the true significance of the day extended far beyond the party. Thunder's demonstration proved to the world that recovery was possible even when all hope seemed lost, that conventional wisdom could be overturned by unconventional approaches. Ethan became a symbol of what determination and compassion could accomplish, an inspiration to young people everywhere who doubted their ability to make a difference. His story was told in newspapers and magazines, on television programs and radio shows, spreading the message that true healing required treating the spirit as well as the body. Years passed, and Ethan grew into a man whose influence extended far beyond the borders of Montana. He established programs for young people interested in working with animals, sharing the wisdom he had gained and nurturing gifts in others that might otherwise have gone undiscovered. Thunder lived to a remarkable old age, spending his final years in the peaceful pastures of the Hartwell Ranch, always within sight of the boy who had saved him. When the great horse finally passed, surrounded by those who loved him, Ethan was at his side, whispering words of gratitude for the journey they had shared. The legacy of that miraculous year lived on in countless ways. In the scholarship fund Richard established in Ethan's name, in the veterinary techniques that were developed based on observations of Ethan's methods, in the countless animals who were healed by practitioners inspired by his story, and most importantly, in the simple truth that the tale demonstrated to all who heard it. That kindness is more powerful than wealth, that patience can accomplish what force cannot, and that sometimes the greatest miracles come from the most unexpected sources. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it with others. Leave a comment telling us what you thought and whether you believe in the healing power of love and connection. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel for more inspiring stories that remind us of the goodness that exists in this world. May blessings follow you wherever your path leads.